interest. Let me start again. I think we've got an interruption there. I'll start from the beginning. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We're privileged to have with us Mr. M.J.Akbar speaking to us today on a topic of great strategic interest to all of us in India, as well as the rest of the world, which is the return of the Taliban to the seat of power in Afghanistan, and the impact that has on India in particular and on the neighborhood. Mr. Akbar is amongst India's foremost public intellectuals with a long and distinguished career in government and public affairs, in journalism and politics. He has a deep understanding of our neighborhood in South Asia and the Middle East, which is reflected in his extensive writings over the years. So without further ado, let me kick things off. Let me hand over to our Vice Chairman of Equities at InCred, Devesh Kumar, to take proceedings forward from here. Devesh, over to you.
Thanks, Venki. And as the topic is well understood and known, I'll not take much time, but I'll just tell you about the flow of the event. So Mr. Akbar will talk now for some time, around 30 to 40 minutes. And after that, we'll have Q&A. And for Q&A, you can put your questions in chat box. About Mr. Akbar or his style, you will experience it in the next 40 minutes. So I'll invite him to start the talk. Mr. Akbar.
Thank you very much, Devesh, and always a privilege to be in such august company, including those from JNU. I only come from the humble Presidency College, so I can't compete. But the subject before us today is extraordinarily important. I know that this is a group whose first priority is economics, it's business, it's the impact on the financial world and so on. But at this moment, the real attention to focus our attention, it will be on instability rather than on economics. Afghanistan simply has never been an important enough player in the world's economic structure to leave an immediate impact. But the instability that it creates can have seismic tremors all across from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The return of the Taliban, in my view, has created a structural earthquake in the extended region. And this earthquake has the most important element, or the trigger of the earthquake, lies in a very, very important fact, which I am afraid both the commentariat and the political class, perhaps for reasons of their own, do not mention quite as often as it should. The Taliban is not about geography. The Taliban is about ideology. And the fact that it is somehow in our focus and in our attention, we've been trapped in the geography of Afghanistan, in a sense, limits our understanding of what it means, not only to Afghanistan, but to the wider world. It represents an ideology, and an ideology which has, whose most important component is foreign policy. This foreign policy actually emerges from a conflict which has been going on for at least 200 years, if not longer. And from the mindset of the Taliban, which is what is important for us in our understanding, we have to see it not from what we think is the right way to go about examining this problem, but from how they think is the way forward. And for them, This conflict is all about the liberation of Muslims from foreign colonization. Now, the more observant of you may have noticed that there was just a slight hint of a pause when I said foreign colonialism, because the temptation to use the term Western colonialism is very high. But at this particular moment, this particular urge or surge towards liberation from colonialism includes Russia. Is Russia belong to the West or does it belong to the East? Most of Russia actually belongs to the East, and to China. And of course, towards us in India. The sense that, and the conviction, we are at the moment, we are in 2021, exactly 100 years ago, or 102 years ago, something very interesting happened in the geopolitics of the world. In the view of the Taliban, this is something that I've examined quite deeply in my book, The Shade of Swords, which was a 2004 book. In this framework of geopolitics, every single Muslim in the world was colonized in 1919 after the First World War, particularly after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and so on. I know that the Turks emerged from it very quickly, but for a brief while, every single Muslim, the whole of Central Asia was with the Tsars, and then the Soviet Union, the British had reached. I mean, they may not have physically entered it, but they actually reached and ruled over Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, the three holy cities. And these are very powerful memories in the thinking of people who believe that liberation is a historical duty of the community. Now, everyone, actually, whether they express it or not, knows this. Let's examine quickly first the 4 countries who still have embassies in Kabul. You might think that China's early wooing of the Taliban through the conduit of Pakistan makes China seem as if it is going to be the biggest ally of Taliban. But remember also that China is a country which takes precautions. Even as it has done its diplomatic outreach, it has also, without any publicity, conducted military exercises along with the Tajik forces. Why is Tajikistan most important? Because the first thrust of expansionism by the Taliban will come in Tajikistan and through it to Central Asia. I'm not repeating anything. I'm not saying anything which is not widely known, at least by those who remember the 1996 era, 1990s, because this is exactly what the Taliban did after 1996. And even if you go back, that these were the Islamicization, quote unquote, plans that were enunciated quite often by General Ziaul Haq of Pakistan when he started and began to basically take the Afghan revolution or the Afghan jihad towards the template of an Islamic jihad. Tajikistan nearly fell. They had to, I mean, they were at the doors of Dushanbe. And Uzbekistan was very badly affected at the time, and I think it required all the help from friends. Russia itself, I mean, Putin has done wonders in terms of strengthening Russia, but at that time, Russia itself was not much, it was not in a position to do very much. Simultaneously, China has actually appointed as commander of Xinjiang Xinjiang is one of the largest provinces. I think it borders 7 to 8 countries. It has now appointed as its commander, military commander, General Wang Haijiang, who is known as one of the toughest commanders. So they are taking the necessary military steps in case there is a threat. Russia also claims a kind of normalcy with Kabul, but yesterday the Russians have announced that they will supply arms, or they want to supply arms, that would be more accurate, to the Central Asian countries, the CSO countries, on artificially depressed rates so that they are able to afford it. So you can see very quickly how the dynamics of the military situation are changing and how fast they are changing. The other country which is there, Pakistan, their establishment at the moment is in exultant mood. But I think within 48 hours, 72 hours, they have begun to get the blowback. I've said this often, and I repeat it here, that this time around, last time around, Pakistan or Islamabad had more influence over Kabul. This time around, Kabul is likely to have more influence over Pakistan. Why? Because the seeds that were laid in the 1990s and in the 1980s, they have matured. All of you, I think, in this conference, in this group, will remember Lal Masjid, the mosque from where the challenge to Musharraf took place, and eventually Musharraf had to send the Pakistan army in order to crush the revolt that had been manufactured there. I think the Taliban flag, according to what I hear, has already started flying over Lal Masjid. And certainly the Tehreek-e-Taliban has become far, far more voluble and aggressive, and the forces who have supported the Islamic Jihad in Pakistan have begun to crawl out from the hiding places. The Iran and the Gulf are in a wait and watch mode. They are in a silent mode, but many elements in Iran are not as silent as we think they are. There has been a statement issued by, I think, 140 or 150 of their major leaders warning about, because when you talk about the ideology of Taliban, you must remember it is not simply an Islamic Jihad ideology. It is also a very hardline Sunni ideology. And in their framework, they think the Shia, and the Shia are Muslims. I'm not a Shia, but every Shia is, is a Muslim. But in their framework, the Shia are apostates. And apostasy is, in the Sharia, a crime which is punishable by sentencing of death. So, and there are Shias in Afghanistan also. So there is potential for trouble. And certainly there will be turbulence in that region. The Gulf countries and then the other Arab world is immediately apprehensive about how precisely this will affect them, because this worries them a great deal, and they have very good reason to be worried. They have gone through the experience of what was known as the Arab jihadis after the first Mujahideen, not the Arab Mujahid, during the war against Russia, and the Al-Qaeda was one of the byproducts of that region. In Pakistan, the thing to watch will be how far the Al-Qaeda and its associated groups, including Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba and so on, get energized by this development. Interestingly, Russia has already announced, and I think this was again yesterday or this morning, that it is willing to play a mediation role. Now, a mediation role is very interesting because the ability of Panjshir, which is Shah Massoud's sons, people, the former Northern Alliance, will depend very heavily on how much support they can get from, they are on the border of Tajikistan, and how much cross-border support they can manage, not necessarily in order to expand their space, but definitely in order to protect what space they have managed to glean from the shambles of the collapse. Most important, or at least among the most important things, is the fact that the Afghan people know the true nature of the ideological offensive that awaits them. All of us here have seen the picture of a baby being thrown to the American troops, and then I think there were British troops as well. It was heartbreaking. But trust me, the truly heartbreaking picture is the one we never saw. I want to see a picture of the mother's face who threw the baby. Can you imagine what must be going through her mind? That she is sacrificing her own child so that the child may live. It's one of the gestures which, in my view, will define the threat, defines the threat that we face better than all the words put together. The Taliban's immediate policy, in my view, will be what I call mission creep. They will not suddenly, overnight, announce a dramatic leap forward into the kind of society they established by 1997, 1998. No, they will do it one step at a time. That's not only because maybe their friends in Islamabad or elsewhere are telling them to be cautious. It is also because they want to consolidate power. It is not a transfer from one recognized legitimate source of power to another recognized legitimate source of power. It's an upheaval. Therefore, they will need to use their troops, their bureaucracy, if they have one, in order to create a government and then stage-wise consolidate their presence and their control. It's not so easy to control a country like Afghanistan. Yes, at this moment we know that they are that the leader of Herat is actually in Kabul. We certainly know that the Karzais are there, and so on and so forth. But is this a tactical kind of situation, or is it what we are going to see in the future? In my view, this is only a tactical caution, and which the stage is being set for something else, and we can hear it in the statements that are emerging. You take a very significant statement. Everyone is interested and worried, deeply worried, that 20 years of gender empowerment and gender equality that have been achieved, it is one of the most significant achievements of Afghanistan. I tell you, I have been there very often. I have seen Kabul, which is radically different. I saw Kabul when it was just been liberated from the Taliban. And it was a completely, it was a city in mourning, silent, women still in their homes, generations wiped out in that sense. But 20 years later, there is a generation. Anybody born in 2000 is 22 years old. There are women who are educated. there is a very strong and vibrant middle class which does not want to, which we saw some examples for on Independence Day, when they were so courageous as to come out with the national flag rather than the Taliban flag. So, but when the Taliban was asked, they said, yes, yes, we will look after the women if they become Sharia compliant, which means that in their view, what has happened in the last 20 years is not Sharia compliant. So as I said, this is something that at some meetings I have argued when this collapse had not happened, that the world has a choice. You can either accept the peace or want the peace of a garden, or accept the peace of a graveyard. Right? Taliban-free Afghanistan was on its way. It's not just, it was difficult, but it was on its way to creating at least a few gardens in the country. Now, the return of the prospect of the peace of the graveyard is something that should deeply concern us. The big question, of course, which is should be called the $64,000 question, the $64 million question, the $64 trillion question. With Americans, dollars, the figures are sometimes quite bizarre. But the question is, what will America do? Because what happens to America definitely has impact across the world. It may not be the kind of superpower that it thinks it should be or it ought to be, but it's certainly instability created by the departure of America's, I would say, psychological role across the world will have very significant consequences, and consequences that will affect the economy, affect trust, affect communication, and affect movement. Let us be clear about one thing, and when I hear this from the Honorable President of America saying that it is all about troops and this and that, I'm afraid that is not true. It is not about troops. I think some of you may be surprised to learn that America had only 2,500 troops or something of that sort left in Afghanistan. It actually abandoned Bagram Air Base, leaving behind God knows how many $1 billion worth of equipment for the present government, with nobody affected. There is no American soldier who has been killed in the last 18 months, 20 months. America has troop presence all over the world. It has troops in Korea. What do those troops signify? They signify the maintenance of stability and geopolitical stability. Right? 2,500 troops were enough to maintain stability of the kind we saw, or comparative stability, not because of the number of troops, but because they represented the power of the American response. Right? And therefore, that was the true power of America. That, if anything happens to us or our allies, then the full, the great strength of America will come into play. America has about 900 troops in Syria just now as we speak. Nobody talks about it. What are they there? They're not there to win wars, but they are to fly the flag. And flying the flag is critically important. Before I go back to America, briefly to say that, yes, there will be a temptation in both Moscow and China to fill the vacuum that is being left behind by this American retreat and perception of retreat elsewhere. But it will not be so easy to fill. It's not so easy to fill either in terms of capacity or in terms of actual, because that presence is a combination of military and economic power. It's not simply just military power. America has 4 default modes all through its history. One is the temptation to isolationism. And that is a very, very, I think, serious possibility that it may, large parts of America may go back to the parda of isolationism, particularly if they are being encouraged by their leaders to do so. Second, very important in the American psyche, that if they get hit, there will be vengeance. I mean, this whole removal of Taliban from Kabul was after all a consequence of 9/11. Now, I would not imagine that anyone would be so foolish in the complex world of Taliban and its associates to do anything like instigate anything like terrorism in America. The short-term gains will be quickly defeated by the long-term consequences of that. And while you may not get any big event, I'm equally confident that there will be multiple, what I call microaggressions, fueled by either the Taliban or its associates. They will find that almost irresistible. And what will be America's response to it? Of course, we cannot say, only time will tell. There is the third aspect of the America, the superpower, which is what I call becoming a messiah of democracy. I think that we can forget about. They're not going to talk this language again, at least in the present president's term. Their credibility on this has collapsed, and so nobody will believe it. And then comes America's role as defender of a capitalism or capitalistic order. Right? How far they will need to re-involve themselves in world affairs in order to protect this economic framework is something that we will see. But that is something that they will have to do, because if they don't do it, the consequences on their own economy will be huge, huge. And the trickle effect or the byproducts of that American, what shall I say, nervousness or collapse will be very, very significant. We'll have to ask ourselves another question. Has President Biden, been fatally wounded politically? When Ryan Crocker, who is Obama's ambassador to Kabul, can write in the New York Times that this absolutely unbelievable collapse is, quote unquote, a huge boost to militant Islam everywhere. It's a disaster. When he can say that now the believers clad in the armor of true faith have vanquished the infidels. I mean, all this language that is coming up. When Tony Blair can say what probably Prime Minister Johnson believes but can't, which is that every jihadi around the world is cheering. Well, they're only telling you the facts as they are. This is a consequence. And I think everybody agrees that, even if America had to leave, there are ways of, of leaving a country without retreating from what is clearly in the mutual interest or in the interest of the world. And this is something which is completely inexplicable. How do you run? And where is there to hide? Can America hide from Afghanistan? It can't. So the questions that are going to be asked and answered in the forthcoming future will be very, very critical to the dynamics of what involves. I think very much everybody will be watching with a great deal of interest on Panjshir, everybody will be watching how exactly in the next 12 weeks the world behaves, what happens after the rescue mission is closed. Actually, in a sense, this rescue mission is open-ended, because if you're going to wait for everyone who wants to get out to be helped, it could take months. So everybody knows facts that I'm going to tell you that, but I may as well mention that we all know that Afghanistan has tremendous mineral resources. Somebody says $1 trillion, whoever your estimates can be, but certainly it has the world's second largest copper mines, only 17 or 20 miles from Kabul. And it has the world's largest reserves of lithium. But to those who are eagerly, ogling those resources, you might be surprised to find that the Taliban might be more protective of it than the previous regime. The one thing that India's own responses are, fairly obvious. India has to understand that there is now a direct threat of sanctuaries, which are now going to become sanctuaries in 2 countries rather than 1. And they get protection, not only from Islamabad, they get also protection from Kabul, the space as well as the nature of the, forces that they have built up having got Kabul under their power. The Taliban also now has human resources with which to go and instigate trouble elsewhere. And this is something that I'm sure we are deeply worried and concerned about. And I'm sure our Prime Minister is doing all that is necessary to meet this actual and potential threat. We must remember that war is infectious once you start it, and it's to use terms that are now becoming the language of post-COVID or COVID situation. The infection may start in Wuhan, and suddenly it becomes a Brazil variation and a South Africa variation and a Delta variation, and you don't know where the connectivities lie. Alas, no one has found a vaccine against war. But this much must be central to, I think, the foreign policies of all responsible nations, all responsible, despite the fact that there may be differing interests and even conflictual relationships. But I think the responsible nations of the world must agree on one thing, that they must unite against any instrument of disorder. This is extremely important. And those instruments of disorder are now taking the shape of organizations which have got protection, financing, money, arms, and let us face it, ability to strike and create problems, which are multinational in their impact and scope. So we are entering another phase of troubled times. Troubled times demand really the kind of leadership that is required in war as we search for that ever elusive thing called peace. Thank you, Devesh. I think this should be enough for whatever introductory remarks before you go to the next stage. I can't hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir, for very concise and very exhaustive coverage of the topic. And before we start Q&A, I have one question. What happens to Indian investments in Afghanistan?
Our investments in Afghanistan, basically, this is the power of having done the right thing. Our investments in Afghanistan are not investments in private sector companies that you finance, right? They are investments in infrastructure. They're investments in dams. They're investments in construction. They're investments in institutions, which are, I mean, the larger part of it, not whole of it. The second is the relationship between Afghanistan and India in terms of market. You know, I helped start the air freight, which was very successful. Started from one occasional plane to any number of planes every month, because Afghanistan found a market for its dry foods and this, that, and the other. Yeah, I don't know what is the situation in Bombay, but if you go to Delhi and ask for dry fruits now, the prices have gone up. Very important fact is that, and this may be an important signal for the future, the trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan has gone up by more than 50% in 1 week. This may be also partly a reluctance or the inability of other nations to trade with Afghanistan. Once we see what is quite possible, sanctions, once the presence is out and so on, and if the world gets sanctions, then Pakistan and Afghanistan will be partners. One, a subsistence economy based essentially on the price of drugs, and the other completely bloated sort of economy financed by foreign loans at very high prices. So I don't see much hope of a stable economic growth coming from the partnership of these two nations.
So I'll like to request Mr. U.R. Bhatt, who is attending the session, to ask you a question. Mr. Bhatt, you can unmute yourself and start the video.
Thank you, Mr. Akbar. It was a wonderful presentation on the state of affairs in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
See, Taliban 2.0, as it were, seems to be saying the right things about their being concerned about global opinion, that they want foreign aid and they want foreign presence, they want people to invest. Can one believe that this Taliban 2.0 is an improved version of its earlier self, and that it is at least a bit concerned about what the global opinion makers think of them?
No, I think I mentioned the answer to this question in the very beginning, but I didn't do it at length. I just flagged it, as it were. So your question is very welcome for me to elaborate on this. When I said that it is not about geography and it is not about economics, it is about ideology. This is an ideological movement. And once it abandons its ideology, then it does not remain a movement. Then it becomes like anything else, anyone else in Afghanistan. Right? Then why replace Ghani or replace anyone else? You don't go through this massive upheaval only as part of a neighbor's strategic interests. That may play some part in it, but it cannot be the substantive fuel to a popular, or to change. Therefore, the Taliban cannot go far beyond its ideological framework. Now, when it comes to, let us say, saying it wants foreign investment in what precisely? It already has foreign investment in opium, because the returns from the market go into its economy. Maybe only a small sum, but that is what. But in terms of other things, it cannot. Number two, if it changes, right, as you suggest, and of course what you suggest is theoretically possible, but if it changes, then it loses the support of its own cadre. It's a cadre-based organization. It's a base of people who have been taught from the moment they entered the madrasa a certain, ideology. So they cannot move too far away from that ideology. right, at this moment or at any given point. So I don't see them as number two. Of course, the first requirement of any investment, even political investment, let alone economic investment, is trust. Who is going to trust them?
Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Bhatt, you have any further question to ask?
That was a that is a good answer. But basically now, if they have to, in fact, one of the statements that I read was that they want to make Afghanistan drug-free or something to that effect. So if that is the case, then they need to really. I saw somewhere that they had mentioned something about they want to make Afghanistan drug-free.
Yeah, Mr. Bhatt. Yeah, let me say that even President George Bush, when he entered Afghanistan in 2001, wanted to make Afghanistan drug-free. You see, how can you take away people's livelihood, the farmer's livelihood, when he has no other forms of livelihood? How has the Taliban been financed for the last 20 years? Except, from these farmers by taking a percentage from this traffic. So they can come and say, Mullah Omar said exactly the same thing in 1996. He also said that they wanted international acceptance and relations and this and that and the other. Right? It didn't happen. Of course, there is more bandwidth this time. And I think more countries are willing to give them a chance. But I fear, I suspect that, say, Russia and China are giving them a certain recognition as a precautionary measure. Whatever you do, don't hit us. That's the unspoken bargain. Right, of course, there is also the schadenfreude of watching America lose for many countries. But we know that will come, that will collapse, that will end very quickly. Long-term interests, more stable considerations will eventually come to the fore. And when they come to the fore, you will see how the Taliban behave. I mean, it would be very sensible of them to leave Kabul alone as it is. But we shall have to wait and watch and see whether it is the same Kabul or not.
Yeah. The next question is from Sanjay Chawla. Sanjay, you like to unmute and switch on your video also.
Thank you, Mr. Akbar. Really appreciate your insightful views. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. I remember the interaction we had a couple of years back. So my question is really partly is a follow-up of what Mr. Bhatt was asking in terms of help us understand what are the economics of the potential unrest that we are likely to see in Afghanistan. And the B part of the question is, what is the role that you envisage China playing in Afghanistan?
China will first, China's first priority, if I was sitting in Beijing and trying to look at one's interest, will be how to protect its investments in Pakistan from cross-border terrorism. An ideological movement like the Taliban is not always fully under control of its own leaders. And there will always be people who will have. Number two, it certainly doesn't want Taliban to, which it won't be, of course, but China has also interests which are very vital in Gwadar and Balochistan. The pipeline, the city, the connectivity, the BRI. So China is saying, all right, join our, one world, one road kind of thing. But these are very initial, mutterings. The world has not yet thought through a consolidated or a long-term policy, and it cannot until we see what happens. We have seen one dramatic event, but is this the beginning of another series of dramatic events? right? Or will these people be contained? Who is going to actually lead? At the moment, all you know about Taliban government is from their spokesperson, right? That's all we know. But, we'll have to see whether Mullah Baradar and those people, what they are talking about, how much of an independent view they finally acquire in terms of their understanding of what their requirements and potential are. Yes, I can almost certainly say that nobody is going to be so stupid as to try another 9/11 Iraq. But as I said earlier somewhere, that the world has to be prepared for microaggressions, and some of them not very micro. For example, if they feel that the world will not respond in any concerted way, if, let us say, our national interests are hit, or they intervene in some way or the other, or they hype up terrorism in our country, they may come to a conclusion that yes, there will be the ritual condemnation, but no one will do anything more, right? They will have to take a call on Xinjiang. In China, as I told you, China has appointed its toughest general there already. It's beefing up its military presence because China, talk sweetly but carry a big stick. So everybody is at the moment seeing what next, and what next is not something that will happen next week. What next? Maybe what will happen in 2022.
So thank you so much for this. Just a follow-up. Do you believe that US actually vacated the space in order to ensure that China would try to divert China's attention from the Taiwan side and gets more embroiled in this side, so that at least that tension could be eased in Taiwan? Thank you.
Yeah. That is the ultimate of cutting your nose to spite your face. But I don't know. I think even such contorted thinking is beyond the capabilities of Washington's think tanks. The Americans lost nerve. Let's be very clear about it. And their loss of nerve surprised their enemies as much as their friends. You can see from the bewilderment of the British. I mean, how can at the middle of a war, you don't take a call from the British Prime Minister for a day and a half because you don't have an answer? There is no question. I mean, G7, NATO, it's a NATO operation. It is not an American operation. I think some clause in NATO says, and it was invoked when the Americans entered Afghanistan, that an attack on any country is an attack on all countries, and therefore they all cooperated. Right? Now, when it comes to withdrawal, you don't even consult NATO. Everybody is surprised. Everybody is left scrambling. I mean, it was completely as an exercise in government behavior. I'm afraid it's not a day that Americans will want to remember, not an event that Americans will want to remember.
Yeah. Jay, you want to ask a few questions, like collect, compile, and put the questions?
Yeah, so I have one question, but before that, I will ask a question put by Dipojal Saha. He is saying that, Taliban, where did they get all this manpower from? So where the training happening somewhere else, and if secretly then was American, they were taken by a surprise.
Yeah, the manpower came from Quetta. The madrasa in Quetta, those of us who follow the minutiae of, there were 3 madrasa imams who actually announced, oh, we are so happy that because when this advance started, then the push began. And the estimates are that between 20 to 40,000 children from madrasas were mobilized and sent. In fact, they were all told that with the Taliban government being formed, you will all get jobs. So, for impoverished kids, it's an attraction, and so on. And of course, they wanted Taliban there. So this is the whole training ground, the whole apparatus. Americans, the West, everybody has allowed them for 20 years. There have been occasional strikes. Mullah Baradar's predecessor was hit by a drone. But the whole nexus and apparatus has been kept in place, which I think every Afghanistan president has said repeatedly, spoken repeatedly about. But, I think in the long game, nerve was, the Americans simply lost the nerve. None of their allies did, but the allies, Britain and Europe, they simply are not in a position to operate independently.
Sir, I have a question, and the Afghan economy is roughly about $22 billion. And the budget is roughly, but the government budget is about $5 billion. And I think almost 1/4 is domestic, but almost 3/4 of the budget is all grants and aid from outside. Taliban, after this 20 years of hibernation, so to speak, do you think they have the capacity, the administrative capacity, the capacity to run the economy, the central banks, and say finance ministry, because they have not been able to manage such large chunk of money? And recently, there was a news item that $9.5 billion of Afghan central bank money in Fed was frozen by President Biden. Do you think that they have that kind of capacity to really take the administration forward, take the economy, take care of the economy?
There was a lesson told to me by one political economist whose name is probably not remembered because he was a Marxist and he was a finance minister of the CPM in Bengal. And he was very fond of me and we got on. But he said one thing which I remember, and I have absolutely no sympathy for Marxist economics, but he said no nation is ever bankrupt. Right? All you do is live within a different set of means. Now, the Taliban's idea of a successful economy may be very different from yours. Okay. Right? They would, I think, concentrate first on ensuring food, because if you don't ensure, food at reasonable prices, right, and actually at throwaway prices, then your government cannot be sustained. People will not accept it, as simple as that. First you fill your stomach, then you come and talk to me about religion or ideology. Right? So I think their first priority will be that, and their second priority. But they, large parts of Afghanistan really look after themselves in this matter, as I said, because you mentioned the figures, but the estimate of the drugs economy is 10 billion. Now, whether it is included in the official figures or not, I don't know, but that's what it is. So if you're saying it's 22, then the economy is 30 billion. And out of the 10 billion, actually, they are supposed to be getting only 3 or 4. The rest goes into other. So, jo bhi ho, they are not going to need vast sums for requirements of governance as we understand it, vast projects, these things and so on. They will concentrate their spending on 2 things: food, maintenance of a very strong military, and third, maintenance of a law and order mechanism, a police mechanism, which would probably be a religious police mechanism. Right? The rest, they are very happy to live in huts. They are not interested in it. It is not one of their peak demands in life. The rest is all superfluous to their basic economic superstructure. But the point is that are the people, after 20 years, of having experienced something else, going to be content with the subsistence economy or not? That's, can you maintain price levels of the extras? That's the point. You know? And again, I don't think they have any thinkers. I mean, you also remember one thing, and this is a point I probably missed, that their military success, as in 1996, is fully and completely because of Pakistan's military officers who have provided the ground level leadership. Right? And so whilst Pakistan's army undoubtedly has capacity, right, I don't think Pakistan's economists have the capacity to provide alternative models for the flourishing Taliban government.
Sir, next question is from Satish Rana. Satish, you would like to unmute,
Yeah.
remove your video also?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Thanks for this wonderful exposition on Afghanistan. But I think a deeper question that comes through and comes through quite again and again is the fact that Islam has not modernized adequately to prevent such a problem from recurring. And whether it be Syria, where you have a tyrant who is controlling his people, or it be in Afghanistan or Pakistan or any of the geographies, it doesn't seem as though the common population have moved beyond the jihad concept of going to heaven after giving up the mortal body here. It's not going to stop at all, right? I mean, whether it be, and that is what China also realizes, Russia also realizes, and probably America has realized after a painful 20 years. So shouldn't the world probably learn to live with this and then move on? Because there's no way anybody can tackle it. And if Rudyard Kipling's words ring true, East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. I think probably this is just, it's not even ever going to change, right? I mean, a slightly cynical view, unless the people want to change themselves.
Okay, let's start with Mr. Rudyard Kipling first. That poem is actually about brotherhood. Huh? It's not about the clash of civilizations. It is, please read it. This is the most misquoted verse regularly, not just by you. It's about the friendship between the son of a British colonel and the son of a tribal chief, Kamal Khan. And how, after competing in a horse race and this, that, and the other, they become friends. And as the term says, that they went together as blood brothers and escorted back to the... It's a very fascinating and beautiful poem, but it's quite misunderstood because of just two lines which have been misappropriated. Now, come back to the first term that you used, has Islam modernized? No, let's not confuse Islam with Muslims. Or you will next be saying that, I'm not a Muslim or I'm not modern. One of the two, right? Number two, that this business of what is modernization of a faith is, a very complex one. I mean, has any epic, whether it is the Old Testament, whether it is Mahabharata, whether it is Ramayana, have you come across any modern versions of them? They remain the original versions that we have accepted, right? Whenever they might have been written. Now, the question really is not the faith, if Islam was incapable of entering the 21st century, as you suggest, right? Then every Muslim country in the world would have been Taliban. I mean, I'm sure you go to Indonesia in your work? Right? Do you find the Taliban there? And so on and so forth. So I think we should be very clear that we must not confuse Islam with Muslims. Many Muslims are trapped in what I have elsewhere in a very long essay called the romance of regression. They are living, searching for a dream world from the past because many of them are incapable of managing or coming to terms with change and coming to terms with every evolving society. Right? That happens in, I think, about every faith. You will get 10% of people, 15% of people who are trapped lately in their own cocoons. The problem is that the political manifestation of that syndrome is found expression in many places in the Muslim world where governance has not been up to the standards that people expect them to be. That's a different story, and that's a separate matter. In terms of Afghanistan, it's, I mean, I refuse to call this a victory of Taliban. I merely call this a defeat of America. And I think we should work within this difference to find ways out. This is a very, very unfortunate development. I began by saying that this is a structural earthquake, in geopolitics, and it will do a lot of damage. The people who did this because they wanted to protect some votes in the Midwest, you can't, risk world stability for very minor partisan considerations. And it doesn't behove of a superpower with the maturity, strength, and power of America to abandon a critical metaphor of its place in the world. That is what it had become. And so I am looking at the immediate and the extended future with a great deal of interest on how things develop. I don't believe that America will remain what it is. It will have to recover. The American establishment will find ways. It may not happen tomorrow, this week, and so on. Will find ways of getting back and winning back its place in the world order.
Is it because of the end of oil as we know it, and America's interests were always to protect its oil interests in the Middle East, and it had to surround the Middle East with its own set of territories, and Afghanistan was key in protecting its territory because of its access to Iran and Iraq and all these places. And now that with oil in a decline in terms of its need and future due to lithium technology or EVs coming through, the interest in spending so much money to protect oil is come down. It's more economic rather than anything else.
Oil was a big factor in the 1990s, wasn't it? And yet America allowed Taliban to be there. If 9/11 had not happened, America would not have acted. And in fact, if you know the history of that period, you know that they were actually beginning to open secret talks with the Taliban. So America protects its interests in that region, not so much by land as by the sea. Its fleets of Bahrain, its base of Bahrain, and its ships, they do whatever necessary protection that is. Afghanistan is 1,000 miles away from Qatar. So it's, Kabul is at least. And America's role in that region is not motivated by oil so much as by the necessity of a stable world order. Taliban is no threat to anyone's mineral resources. Taliban is a threat of war. Supposing that the Taliban ideology gets into the Gulf, That's the problem. It's already in Pakistan, as they will realize soon enough.
Yeah.
It's a geopolitical thing rather than geo-economic.
Yeah. So now I'll request Mr. Nitin Rao to ask the last question, and after that, Jay, you summarize all the remaining questions and put one question in the end. So Nitin ji.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. It was a very informative session and a pleasure to listen to you. My question is more related from an Indian perspective, because let's assume America goes out and whatever has to happen there happens. But you did mention Pakistan, you did mention the ideology there. And if you were to look, say, 1 or 2 years forward into how this will expand into India, what do you think is your reading on this expansion into the geopolitical part, maybe the northern part of India, and the impact on our politics?
Yes, absolutely valid, Mr. Rao, very valid. And I think we are going to be their first target. It's my view. They will not seek to instigate problems in China so quickly. They think of us as a comparatively soft state, and they think that we are more vulnerable. And I think we have to be prepared for a very, very serious threat situation. They will also use mechanisms to create disorder. And I think at the moment people are very cognizant of the dangers and are quietly, but thinking things through. But your point is very valid, and if you have a worry, then that is very valid too. Very valid too.
So what is the solution for that? Because yes, the worry is there, but
the solution is Indian ability. People underestimate Indian ability. We have, because we are a democracy and we smile and so on and so forth. I think our neighbors have also realized. One neighbor which thought that everything could be won by war has realized that, don't take us on. Although from 48 onwards, they have been coming to war with us. The second neighbor has also, I think, realized that you can't just tread on our territory. One of the reasons for that is because when we say we have a defense force, we mean it. We don't have an offense force. We don't go out with aggression in my mind. But we understand the meaning of defense. Not a single inch will be lost. And if Indians are hurt, there will be accountability. And this message is going through.
So in the process, because maybe US may ally with us, we could emerge a little stronger. Maybe
So
2
I don't
years.
know about who is allying with us and who is a dependable ally or not. But allies should not leave the field.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. It was a little tough question.
Thank you.
Sir, I have one question of mine, and then I will combine a couple of questions which are there. So one question Namrata Mittal has asked. She's saying that what is the end game to Taliban's move in Afghanistan? And so does it stay as a country with continued political instability, or what are the various case scenarios that we can see? And do you think that the US will be forced to intervene again? So if the threshold of instability goes, beyond what is acceptable.
I think very, very perceptive. And I hinted when I said that this time it will not be Islamabad influencing Kabul, but Kabul influencing Islamabad. This is precisely what I was meaning, that the first infection of instability will go through the frontier and into Pakistan. And we'll have to watch that because, and Pakistan's governments are not popular at this moment. Their economy is not under control. The army stretched there. So any Talibanization of the people becomes a dangerous phenomenon there.
Especially given the nuclear armed.
Yeah,
Pakistan.
absolutely. I've forgotten that. Yes, I mean it's a nuclear power. It's got tremendous nuclear power. It's one of the world's biggest. So the dangers are extreme, and that is at a time. It is because of that nuclear power that the world will have to intervene. Have to, if they feel that this power is now within the control of people who cannot always be expected to behave rationally or responsibly. And that immediately extends the threat to us, of course. And you asked, where's the end game? I wish if you start playing an end game here, the scenarios are fairly...
Darshan Engineer has one last question, and then we can close the session. He's saying that why is the Western media whitewashing Taliban as a peaceful, force this time around?
Is it? I don't know. Governments are trying to claim it because they don't have the will to stand up. But I think media, by and large, is quite effective in its. Don't forget that a lot of journalists are still in Kabul.
So Devesh, I think we can close the session.
Okay. So you propose vote of thanks?
Thanks a lot, sir. It was quite insightful. I did take a lot of notes as well. So I will not repeat what you have said, but something which strikes me, what you said is war is infectious. And the fact that it would be Kabul, which would be dictating terms, so to speak, on Islamabad, and the so-called the mega blunder which America has done, that can cost the world economy a lot. The geopolitical stability may be injured for a long time to come, and that would require all the responsible powers, as you mentioned, to come together and stand against any disorder. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to all the participants. We close the session now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jay. Thank you, Devesh. Thank you, everyone who came here. And
Great.
Good evening. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good evening, sir.